As NGOs who want to work at the grassroots level, want to impact people at that level, but sometimes it is very difficult to reach the underserved people. Then, most importantly, we have to deal with certain perceptions about NGOs. There's a growing attack on NGOs on the continent. Some of them founded, others not founded. For instance, people ask, what should be the right role of an international NGO? Should they be involved in policy making? A study conducted by AED for USAID that analyzed the role of NGOs in 4 countries in basic education clearly shows that in the area of education policy, there's resistance amongst policymakers in Africa. They believe that international NGOs must work within certain limits. And you can understand that. Many policymakers in Africa, they still remember that, in not too 40, 50 years ago, they were under colonial rule. And they do not want another form of colonial rule through the back door. I have discussed with some policymakers, they have that serious concern. So when the NGOs, when you go and work with African policymakers, you see some resistance. It is based on that assumption. And some policymakers also feel that NGOs should try to restrict their activities at the grassroots level where they can make greater impact. So in the area of policy, it's a big challenge for us. And we know that without a change in policy, it is sometimes difficult to make great impact in service delivery. There's also the issue of interference in local politics. Some policymakers believe that NGOs can sometimes overstep their bounds, especially when you have an NGO working in democracy and governance, and at the same time working in basic education. Not all African countries, some African countries are a bit sensitive to such issues. And you see restrictions, like in a case like Ethiopia, where there are strict restrictions on what NGOs can do. And that is why you see a lot of demand on registration of NGOs. You can do this, you can't do that. So that's a challenge we have to deal with. There's also the belief in some African countries that NGOs are development tourists. They just come as development tourists, quote unquote. It's a perception we have to deal with sometimes also. There's also this perception we have to deal with that NGOs are not interested, even though they preach it, they are not interested in sustainability. Because pressed to its logical conclusion, sustainability and self-reliance will throw NGO out of business. So all these are perceptions we have to deal with in the field. And arising from this, therefore, what do we do as non-governmental organization? What is the way forward? And in conclusion, I want to try to adjust a statement. Now, this is the statement made in that study I referred to on the role of NGOs in basic education. This is how it was concluded. That fundamentally the question is no longer whether NGOs should play a role in the educational sector. So it is agreed. We all agree. I agree with that. But how NGOs are most likely to fulfill their promise to improve the quality, equity, accountability, and pertinence of education in African countries. That's the statement. That's the conclusion of that study on the role of NGOs. Now, I would like to modify that statement. There's a fulfill their promise. So there's a promise. Now, some African critics, there's an article called The Elusive Promise of NGOs. So there are people who still think this promise is a bit elusive. We have to deal with such perceptions. But I will want to modify the statement as follows, that the question is no longer whether NGOs should play a role in the educational sector, but what role and how to play it to improve access to and quality of basic education while being seen as efficient. In other words, we have to be efficient. We must be seen to be accountable, because that's a growing issue. Even in the World Bank, a recent study raised the issue of accountability. While being seen that we are grassroots, there is a tendency and a temptation among some NGOs, especially the larger NGOs, to work at the policy level, forgetting that the fundamental of NGO is non-profit, grassroots, working with the people. While being grassroots, while being apolitical, there's also a temptation to move into politics while trying to influence policy. And when you do that, you run into a landmine. And also while maintaining the character, non-profit character, and the voluntary character of NGOs. And also while being seen, we should be seen to be filling a void, to be filling a gap, the gap created by the withdrawal of state, of government, from certain services for the poor, the gap created by the inability of the private sector to invest in services that benefit the underserved. Thank you.